was 18, living in a small rundown town in rural Texas, far from the nearest city. The roads were quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows your business, and life moves slowly, almost like it's stuck in time. My parents didn't have much, so I was attending a local community college. It wasn't much, but it was what I had. One of my best friends, Andrew, had moved to San Antonio to study at a bigger college, and we kept in touch. One weekend, he invited me to crash at his place, and since it was only about an hour and a half away, I decided to visit. I wasn't driving anything fancy, just my old 1995 Toyota pickup, which was more rust than metal at this point. The gas gauge was broken, so I had to track the miles since the last fill-up. It was a Friday afternoon when I left, around 3 p.m., with no traffic to speak of. I was flying down Route 90, enjoying the empty roads. I arrived at Andrew's place in good time, and we spent the night partying with his roommate. When his girlfriend finally showed up the next day, things took a turn. They argued all day, their relationship deteriorating right in front of me, but I stayed out of it. Later that night, I decided I'd leave. It felt awkward, and I wasn't sure how the night would go with her there, so I said my goodbyes and headed back home. It was already past midnight. The drive back was uneventful at first. The night was quiet, the road ahead stretching out like a dark, endless tunnel. Route 90 was deserted, just the way I liked it. No cars, no noise. I had the whole road to myself, speeding along, thinking I could make it home in no time. But suddenly I felt the truck stutter. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then stalled completely. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. I had completely forgotten to fill up the tank before leaving. The gas gauge had been broken for so long, and I didn't even think to check. I pulled off to the side of the road and tried restarting the engine, but it was useless. The truck wasn't going anywhere. Frustrated, I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was just as useless as the truck. No signal. I tried dialing anyway, but of course, nothing went through. All I could do was turn on my hazard lights and wait. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the dark road, hoping someone would pass by. Every time headlights appeared in the distance, I would wave my arms, hoping for help. But each time, the car just zoomed past me, ignoring my desperate signals. It was starting to feel like I was invisible, like I was completely alone in this vast, empty stretch of road. As the minutes dragged on, I began to lose hope. It was getting colder, and the silence around me was oppressive. The occasional car would pass by, but none of them stopped. I couldn't help but think that maybe I should just wait until morning, sleep in the truck and try to figure things out when the sun came up. I leaned back in my seat, resigned to the idea of spending the night on the side of the road, feeling both scared and exhausted. My eyes started to close, the quiet hum of the night lulling me toward sleep. Just as I was drifting off, a sudden sound jolted me awake, a car door slamming shut. My heart raced as I snapped my eyes open. I looked into the rearview mirror, but saw nothing but darkness. I turned around, straining to see in the distance. A car had pulled up behind me, its headlights off, and I couldn't see anyone inside. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Maybe someone had stopped to help, but something about the situation felt wrong. I hesitated for a moment, then got out of the truck, calling out, "Hello?" But there was no response. I walked closer to the vehicle, checking the inside, but it was empty. The truck was dark and still, like it had just appeared out of nowhere. A knot formed in my stomach as I returned to my own truck, locking the door behind me. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I was about to sit back down when a tap on my window made me freeze. I turned slowly, heart pounding, to see a man standing outside, his face smiling down at me through the glass. I hadn't heard him approach. The smile was unsettling, too wide, too forced. He didn't speak at first, just stood there staring. After a moment, he spoke in a low, calm voice. "Hey buddy, need a hand?" My mind raced, trying to process the situation. I rolled down the window a crack, just enough to speak. "I ran out of gas," I told him, hoping he might offer to help. But instead of offering a gas can or asking if I needed a ride, he simply said, "That's quite the predicament. Step out and give me a hand with this real quick." Something in his tone made my skin crawl and I hesitated, suddenly unsure of his intentions. I stood there, confused for a moment, wondering what he meant by, "Help with this." My heart was racing, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I thought maybe he had a gas can in his truck or something, but when I stepped out of my vehicle and he looked down at me with that same eerie smile, something clicked. This wasn't help. The man was much taller than me, looming over me, and his smile twisted into something darker. He spoke again, but this time his words sent a chill straight to my bones. "I need you to empty your pockets, please." It took a moment for the words to register, and then my blood ran cold. I was standing there, alone in the dark, with nothing to protect myself, facing someone who clearly wasn't interested in helping at all. I knew I had to act fast. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I bolted. I turned and ran, darting toward the trees on the side of the road. I could hear him shouting behind me, his footsteps pounding against the pavement as he chased me, but I didn't dare look back. The only thing I could focus on was the trees ahead, the dark cover they provided. My legs burned as I zigzagged through the underbrush, desperately trying to lose him. I could hear his voice growing louder, cursing and yelling as he followed. "I'll kill you, you piece of..." he screamed, the words cutting through the night air. I didn't know if he wanted me to hear it or if he was just angry, but the fear was overwhelming. My breath was ragged, my heart thundering in my chest. But somehow, through sheer adrenaline, I managed to slip away into the darkness, hiding behind a large tree to catch my breath. I crouched there in the shadows, barely daring to breathe, listening for any sign of movement. The night felt impossibly still, the air thick with tension. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of wind, but no footsteps. I stayed frozen, not wanting to risk being seen, as the minutes dragged on like hours. It was only when the sound of his footsteps finally faded that I allowed myself to relax, though just barely. I stayed hidden behind that tree, my body stiff with fear, too afraid to move, even as dawn began to break. The darkness was finally lifting, but the nightmare wasn't over yet. I couldn't leave until I was sure he was gone. When the first light of morning touched the sky, I finally felt safe enough to move. My legs were stiff, my body aching from hours of crouching, but I forced myself to get up. I cautiously made my way back to the road, keeping to the trees as much as I could, watching for any sign of the man. When I finally reached my truck, the sight of it made my stomach drop again. The doors were wide open, and everything inside was a mess. My glove box had been rifled through, all my belongings scattered. But it was the absence of my hoodie that made my heart race again. I remembered the pocket. There had been something in it, something important. As I scanned the area, I realized just how much damage had been done in such a short time. The truck had been violated, and I had no idea what had happened to the man. Was he still out there watching? Or had he disappeared with whatever he'd stolen? I stood there for a long moment, staring at my truck, unable to move. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. I was shaken, still gripped by the terror of the night, but I knew I couldn't linger any longer. I needed to get out of there. With my hands trembling, I managed to close the doors of my truck, though I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. After what felt like an eternity, I finally waved down a passing car. The driver, a kind older man, agreed to take me to the nearest gas station. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching, waiting. The sense of dread followed me, lingering in the pit of my stomach. I was still a long way from being safe. By the time I returned with the gas and refueled my truck, the sun had fully risen. But the terror of the night still clung to me. I filled the tank just enough to get to a proper gas station, but it felt like I was moving through a haze, every sound making me jump. The moment I finally left the gas station and started heading home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, tracking my every move. As I drove, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me in the distance. Even after I made it home, safe and sound, the fear never truly left. The man, the empty truck, the whispered threats, those images would haunt me for a long time. And I knew one thing for sure. There are predators in the world, and you can never be too careful.